the corporate aspect of defense firms is unique. It's really hugely interesting, and I haven't covered it as much because it's intricate. It's interesting, but it's really complicated, and I've never really been able to properly articulate it in such a short video, unless that video were to be a couple of hours long. But today, something I think I can articulate, perhaps begin to provide an answer for, which is bureaucracy within the defense industry. Now, for a little bit of background, defense firms operate in a very specific manner. They operate in a certain manner. They're generally oriented in being safe. And that's a good thing in a lot of instances. The safety is something engineered within their systems. And there is safety that is inherent by necessity in a regulatory sense. They have to be safe in a logistical sense. They have to be safe in a literal physical health and safety sense often. And they're also very financially safe. They're conservative in some ways, and that's a good thing. Now, this is obvious to some and a surprise to others. A lot of people who are surprised by this are surprised because these are the firms which develop technology. They're the great innovators of our day, and they see that as sort of not intermingling. They don't see conservative business practices and that sort of innovation mingling, largely because we've had so many sort of new age tech firms go against the status quo. And they find it surprising. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who realize why these firms are so reserved, so cautious. It doesn't surprise them. And they understand how they spend their money. First off, they deal with big budgets, of course. In an industry where economies of scale only get developed once your product is affirmed, and that is not a given. They go out of service at some point. It's not something you can develop forever. It only makes sense that one invests minimally in the lower stages of production. I can't remember who talks about it. There's a book, High Output Management by Andrew S. Grove, and it talks about a similar thing. You want to minimize your costs at a lower stage of production. Now, of course, defense firms want to do this because they have such high R&D costs inherently that if you don't do this, you end up with even higher costs, and it leads you, down a lot of really awful rabbit holes, really expensive rabbit holes. And that's not a good thing. So they deal with big budgets, and economies of scale are different than in any other industry. And quite rightly, firms want to minimize their losses. Now, processes, again, are highly expensive. Generally, we're talking about these large, technology or logistics firms. What they're producing is really high unit cost. R&D cost is huge. Logistics cost is huge. Component cost is absolutely huge. And it's something that they largely have to do on their own. Sales is an enormous process. It's a long process. It's a drawn-out project. And so it doesn't exactly seem illogical that those firms, defense firms, decide to be cautious. They have to survive. When even smaller projects are worth millions of pounds and larger projects are worth hundreds of millions of pounds, even billions of pounds, there's very little wiggle room. No room for error because sunk cost is high, and failure leads to a lot of sunk cost. Also, firms have to keep huge inventories. The JIT, which is just-in-time model for supply chains, not the Wong, is basically a strategy which most firms use. It's where you get in only what you need, only what inventory you need, in order to fulfill active orders. Defense firms can't do this. High stock in and out cost and general difficulty of acquiring components and the variety of components they have to acquire for R&D means that that's a near impossible model. So they can't operate on the, what's normalized in our modern day for supply chains, which is the JIT model. So they have to adapt, and they have to adapt under high inventory. And this specialized inventory is based upon development. They'll have to fluctuate this. They'll have to change it over the years as different orders come in because, products and projects don't last forever. It's an industry built on innovation in logistics and in products. And so it's got to constantly evolve, and these stocks can't remain the same. Having high inventory is a risk on its own, but their high inventory fluctuates as well. And as it were, the ticking clock begins. So it's a very exact business. Now, all in all, this can lead to defense firms becoming somewhat bureaucratic. opting to be safe, working within a large company that has refined and clear matrices for decision making. And that, of course, is hugely important for operations. These firms would not survive in the slightest if they didn't do this. But today, I'm going to tell you what I think can be done to fix these certain problems. And do forgive me, because I'm a bit of an armchair student on this. I'm a layman, really, so don't expect anything that will really give proper advanced solutions, but hopefully this, for the industry, will be a bit of a basic start. So, a few questions I have really to ask. First off is there a problem? Is there something that actually needs to be solved? And one could say perhaps not. Perhaps that's just the way these firms are. It's sort of survivorship bias, isn't it? The firms that survive are bureaucratic. And in many ways, it's easy to claim that we can be just fine with this bureaucracy, that these firms perform huge feats of innovation and logistics, and that's really difficult to ignore, and they survive well. Bureaucracy or not, innovation within these firms is amazing. They start off with roots, rain, and rocks, and humans and these firms have managed to build systems which can do ridiculous things. But the question is, are these firms working? The answer is actually yes. And we don't want to change the inherent system, the thing that allows it to run, the thing that allows it to keep safe, despite the fact that it's in such a precarious circumstance. Now, the fact that they have these conservative processes means that they conserve funds, they play it safe. It has a huge role to play, because the more funds conserved means you can put it where it counts. That means they can innovate better, refine supply chains, deliver more value to the modern warfighter. And there are certain processes that have to be maintained. I think we can agree with that. At the very least, there's this clarification of hierarchy structures, qualitative and qualifying mechanisms within the corporate financial oversight system, and of course, for lack of a better word, supply chain ruthlessness and efficiency. These firms have core central components which allow them to operate in such extraneous circumstances, and these may be considered bureaucratic, which aid innovation. Now, of course, one has to keep, to an extent, the set bureaucracy as well. Administrative process, developmental health and safety, competition cycles, and of course, the general law. Things that restrict defence firms and the industry are regulation to some degree. It's not all internal, and that's for good reason. Certain external corporate expectations as well, and the highest standards of transparency that they set themselves, and that's really important. Now, in many ways, those systems facilitate what they do. They create a lack of distraction in what really matters, which is producing systems and solutions internally and externally that matter and function well. Now, that being said, a lot of people I talk to in the defence industry think this can be improved, think that this isn't just the way the industry has to be. There's a claim that's really quite negative, actually, about firm rigidity. Someone even went so far to describe the corporate structure, and this is a quote, as Kafkaesque, with real challenges being Kafkaesque with real challenges being trying to make progress, not just in career but in work, despite the overarching system which works against you. And so clearly people do have an issue. People think that the system is working against them, and I think there's room to make it more efficient. The bureaucracy doesn't necessarily have to exist alone. It's important, but it doesn't have to exist alone. So despite the useful elements, we have to break down what the issue is here and how to fix it. And so we come on to a new question. Another one arises. Is what makes the industry so stable and adept the innovation, the same amalgamation of corporate mechanisms that make it so good at innovation, or able to use resources efficiently through high levels of scrutiny? In my view, actually no. It's the other it's sort of the mechanisms that would allow relief from bureaucracy are not incompatible with the industry based upon the ideas of composition. I don't think that it doesn't match up. Ackman and Aristotle can talk about additional parts not adding up to create a better whole, but in my view, again, we're not creating a whole new whole. We're refining the whole. I think there is a solution to satisfy the problems of corporate structure without damaging the mechanism that keeps the industry alive, that keeps these firms alive. And there are these firms which could utilise perhaps the exclusivity principle to some degree, or parts thereof. The thing is, I have come up with a miniature plan, anyway, because I'm a boring person, to improve how these firms operate, and it's 46-fold. And that seems rather a lot, because it's reasonably lengthy, but today I'm going to do my best to distill it. And I'll just cover a few today. But I think it's important in actually refining this bureaucratic process, keeping what's important, while getting rid of this thing which people dislike about the firms themselves. So first off, the reorienting of how defence firms manage via the use of the Hawthorne effect. Now, defence firms have necessary boundaries. Their efficiency may come in bureaucracy to an extent. It allows them to allocate funds efficiently, and to a degree that is necessary. Large financial projects have to be overseen, because the burden otherwise is too much and dealt with in an efficient and often pretty ruthless manner. Ruthless in the sense that there is little margin for error when project costs for the firm are in the hundreds of millions, potentially even billions of pounds. Yet everyone I talk to says precisely the same thing, that there is a constant sense of micromanagement from project managers. And ironically enough, the project managers I talk to complain about the same thing. And the people who manage the project managers also complain about this sort of stuff. Yet in discussing how this mechanism works, we need to identify what is benefiting and what is detracting from workers. Because obviously there have to be checks. And the way we're going to do this is, I'd say, via actually returning to a more pure form of the Hawthorne effect. So the Hawthorne effect is a theory within organizational workplace psychology. It's the most basic theory that there is. Basically, researchers found that different behaviors occur when the subject is in a state of awareness of their observation. And that led management theorists to realize the power of supervision. And it's not being used in the right way, in my view, within defence firms. People often blast supervisors in general and managers, but the scientific literature in the matter really does prove that increases in productivity occur far more than the cost of a supervisor in monetary terms. It's really quite staggering. Now, is this the only way to go about it? For defence firms, there may be another way, but obviously there has to be oversight anyway. So maximising these supervision roles and verification roles is actually hugely important, and we can utilise the most basic principle of workplace psychology to their advantage in this situation. So, a lot of project managers I talk to see their role as at least partially playing into this effect, even if they don't say it directly. I heard one say something along the lines of scrutiny means people work harder, which is basically the same concept as the Hawthorne effect, and I think this is approached incorrectly, if I'm entirely honest. Defence firms could maximise productivity and prevent employees from getting frustrated with this micromanagement, as one would get if you're, gaining in tenure and there seems to be an equal, if not greater, amount of scrutiny. Many in the industry understand why this happens, but it damages their productivity because they see it as a systemic lack of trust, despite the fact that it's sort of drilled into them that it is necessary. Now, I think the way to go about fixing this is via changing attention channels. Now, the first step is in abandoning micromanagement culture. Now, many will say, well, of course, that's common sense. But it's not common sense, first off, and you may be misunderstanding. What I mean by doing that isn't removing the scrutiny, but reorienting work life around the work itself and the purpose, rather than the scrutiny itself. Offices, in the fact that they have to have so much micromanagement, so much scrutiny, often orient themselves around these sort of aims, and that can be an issue. Now, obviously, one can't get rid of micromanagement. It's an industry where this is actually necessary, but it is possible to minimize it wherever it happens. Now, the Hawthorne effect, for it to be effective, it cannot be employed utilizing the same channel of communication and interaction that we see in defense corporate mechanisms. Management, in a sense, should pivot. And apologies for sounding like corporate corporate buzzword provider, and oh god, I'm turning into one of those awful culture consultants, but they should pivot. Now, to an extent, the CCs are right. Verification mechanisms should be specific channels, and that cannot be achieved if the entire workplace is oriented around these verification mechanisms. That's an issue around certain criteria which aren't actually focusing on the task at hand, but the process of the task at hand. There is no end goal, really, or not as much. Now, again, if we are to look at what the CCs might say, we need to apply a consistent standard of specific criteria to the protocol-based, to communication, to verification. We need to open up other lines of communication, and this again may sound kind of puerile, sound like, someone fresh out of a graduate program. But nonetheless, it is important to create differentiated sessions. It really is. As stated, supervision works because of attention, and when attention is intermingled with direct scrutiny, perhaps even micromanagement, that the project managers and higher-ups have, the supervision power dissipates, the Hawthorne effect becomes less powerful, and the reward mechanisms begin to fade through this. So, in short, managers need to find a way to reduce micromanagement, and, within offices, centre offices, dates around the project itself, rather than purely deadlines, let's say. Now, of course, deadlines do have an important role, but micromanagement should be reduced where possible. And one needs to reduce core mechanisms in verification as a means by which to supervise and to give attention, to proliferate the Hawthorne effect. And this is where many project managers are mistaken. And that's an issue. And it's, this process is likely to produce better ends, motivate employees far, far more, and still maintain the necessary checks that are needed for such an advanced industry. It'll also be reasonably, easy to implement rather than large key systemic change. This is starting with middle managers. And so I think it's quite achievable. In short, the workplace needs to be reoriented from centering around this verification mechanism. And if anything, multiple channels need to be opened up. And that may be technological, that may be administrative. But nonetheless, it is important, because otherwise you do see this sort of bureaucracy coming from the orientation around pure verification. Now, secondarily, this is the second point. The inverse funnel refinery matrices would work probably better than individualistic scrutiny. Now, refinery matrices, in regard to dealing with projects at a higher up level, refinery matrices are a concept developed by Clark. And the inverse funnel orientation makes this so much simpler. The idea that verification in finance departments or higher up engineers, or by any sort of corporate futurologist, as it were, anyone who has to do verification, is determining the feasibility of future development, there should be an inverse funneling mechanism rather than that of the branching mechanism which is utilized at the moment. Innovation can be less than organic and still be effective, but the process that I'm talking about here would likely make it more organic and more effective and still allow for the certain constraints. And it's less costly to the firm. If we think about how a project should go ahead, how checks are carried out in regards to sort of departmental referencing, with finance, as I was saying earlier, all those who determine feasibility often use a branch-like structure, and firms need to lower scopes on this simple qualification line dismissal. This would entail relying on this sort of inverse funneled feasibility structure rather than individual judgment in a branching manner, and judging perhaps more narrowly in the scope of development. And that's actually really important. I would posit that defence firms, which are really R&D heavy, as we know, can delineate financially viable options in decision making, and then the costs operate far more smoothly in developing systems. And this works for the creation of defence systems, but also logistics, finance, other departments within the firm itself. In a sense, it refines the evolution of systems and logistics and all sorts for upgrade, and it certainly works well. Now, this would reduce the number of qualification stages hugely, which means stuff can be done quicker, more efficient, and generally more cheaply and with better focus. And this is a good thing. We want to stop development looking like that branching diagram, more like the, blank file inverse funnel. And that's, something which will actually have an important impact on development as well as processes within the firm itself. Now, this would, as I've said, reduce the number of qualification stages hugely. But some people say you can't really get around directional thought in organizations because that's, to an extent what innovation is. You have to allow freedom. But I would say the upgrading of projects that the defense industry has, it would be far easier to create happier employees that's really based upon expectancy theory. Processes would be less bureaucratic and innovation decisions would likely improve because you have a narrower scope, and that's a very positive thing. And from the implementation of the system itself and auxiliary results. So, in short, what is it? This is less wastage, really. Now, from this inverse refinery funnel, which is something that's not often implemented, you might be thinking I'm a bit of a madman. You're probably thinking one of two things. First isn't there already that sort of blanket policy within defence firms of narrowing scope? And the answer is not really, no. There is direction, but not inverse funneling, which means that the firm ends up with harder processes, more intensive, and actually worse results often, because you've taken more time and taken up more resources in the process. And again, that is the benefit of the firm. That's where bureaucracy comes in to the benefit of the defence firm, in being able to save money, in being able to direct stuff really, really well. So this might actually exacerbate bureaucracy. But on the other hand, it could work really, really well. And actually, if you have less bureaucratic checks, it would probably mean more effective freedom because of that blank file. Now, you're probably thinking either that first one, that innovation works based upon freedom. And I'd agree, but I think this gives people more freedom. But also, there is an end goal in mind. They're not just making products for the sake of it. They're making things that are going to have value to the buyer. And that, at the end of the day, is the government. That's the taxpayer. Now, through the inverse refinery matrix, we can say that we can also find cross-area development as well as aggregate hypothecation of finances. Now, the latter, which is generally, a tax term, I know, but I think it's a pretty apt way to describe it, hypothecation in this scenario. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It would lead to higher financial efficiency and better grouping of resources for projects. If one can then identify what falls under the same inverse funnel purview, then supply chains are more refined, as is innovation. And the refinery matrix does its job in promoting more high-quality goods and services. And the bureaucracy, the good parts of bureaucracy, can be played into. Now, the former, the idea of cross-area development, may even happen organically if one were to allow these funnels to intermingle, as it were. If you can have differentiated inverse funnel matrices, then you can sort of start to have this. And defense firms actually struggle with this because often it's not achievable because there are such split departments. It's information. And the answer to this, I'll talk about this again in another video, is probably, to an extent, devolution, or perhaps even official collaboration with other firms on a non-project basis, on a more permanent basis. But anyway, we'll talk about this at a later date. In any case, the idea of this sort of cross-area development would also benefit the bureaucratic bastions, finance controls, transparency, supply chains, and through this, if it were possible, firms could make a huge effort in maintaining those things which facilitate innovation and efficiency within the firm, and yet make the firm even more cost-effective and efficient in general. And that's a hugely important thing. Now, the second thing that one might be thinking is, does this cripple innovation? Now, that's a good question, because obviously the idea of R&D is that it's organic. It doesn't necessarily create inverse funnel refinery matrices because there's no set end. Well, I would argue not. Again, there is always an end in mind because R&D is trying to prove something, trying to verify something through exploration. But largely that's where this mechanism adds so much value, in narrowing beginnings and finishing at a broader range of points. Nonetheless, the points are laid out. It means, again, ends are worked towards more. Innovation could be anything, sure, but it has something useful. It has a specific set of criteria that create utility. And this could work for R&D quite well, sure, but I see it better implemented for project managers and those directly above them. Now, I'm probably going to run out of filming room on my iPhone, so apologies if that happens. In any case, fundamental idea here is to maximize the buying power of the funds that defense firms have and spend, and also minimize the funds wasted within the corporate structures, which they already do really well. It would just make that better. And through this, innovation through sight of the ends in process and products have proper financial value to the firm and overall value to society, as well as processes which make the firm better and lower the bill for the taxpayer. In sort of conclusion to this little point, this concept is about specific purview and how it relates to other aspects of the firm and the narrowness with which you can look at development in any aspect of the firm. Now next, PR steadfastness, and this is a broader point. This helps everyone, I think, and it will make more sense when I talk about the rest of the other 46 points. I have, or I would agree with, maintaining the benefits of defense bureaucracy while reducing constraint by them. But PR steadfastness is really important, so I'll just talk about it quickly. Firms need to stop thinking that being really quiet or using hedged terms or focusing on contributions to general technological advancement in non-military areas. Not to detract from that, defense firms contribute a lot in that regard. But my point is, defense firms have to stop hedging, shying away from critics. Defense is a noble thing, and pandering to those who don't think it's not positive, or those who don't think it's not so positive, or half-heartedly stating capability in being an unfortunate necessity, doesn't do the industry justice. There is meaning beyond the physical. There is honor within the goods and services themselves, and there's huge value to society, and there's consequence. All in all, defense firms need to talk about more meaning, more behind what they're making, and given their really excellent clarity in other regards when contrasted with other firms of comparable size, this, I think, would actually reduce criticism. Defense firms are going about this the wrong way. They're backing down. And it also leads to another sort of potentially dangerous means of operation. Operation through facade in order to lessen attention is no way to conduct business. Clarity is good for everyone, and belief in the purpose beyond the product is actually really important. Even people who work at these firms should believe in no uncertain terms that what they are doing is for the benefit of society. A profound and important service that requires a lot of effort, and that shouldn't be ignored. Now finally, for today at least, and then you get the other 46 points, which are going to be long and boring like this, and I doubt anyone's actually watching now. For today, the maintenance of what I'm terming bureaucratic bastions, I've mentioned this earlier, is important. Those firm components, like keeping tight control of the purse strings, which allow money to be saved and reinvested where it matters, and that drives innovation, on projects which aren't a dead end. And with a refinery matrix with an inverse funnel, this might be even more beneficial. It is important that defense firms recognize that this has a benefit to them. These bureaucratic processes, while we want to fix it, it has a benefit. They're not cool, hip social media firms. They are large organizations that deal in manufacturing, that have a very specific supply chain, overhead structures, and need to be kept under control. And this is how they've survived for a long, long time. And it will be how they continue to survive. I think that firms do understand this well, but there is a fear at some point. Someone will come in and say, look at what a bounding bureaucratic beast this company is, I'm going to fix it, and try and convert practices to that of the new age tech firms. Defense firms need to realize that even though they have really high overhead, the larger ones this is, the calloused departments that they've built up as a result of this are hugely important. And they're all the sort of departments I've been talking about today, particularly in finance. And it really can't be understated. And I'll go over this more in, some length at a later date. And I didn't run out of film. In any case, hopefully that's a start in how defence firms can refine and maintain the good bits of bureaucracy. I think this is pretty important. Bureaucracy is good to an extent, but defence firms can improve what they're doing. The end.